Well, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. We, south of the border, are great admirers of the work of Canadian scholars on immigration and immigrant integration, and this wonderful Center of Excellence here at York University around that topic. First, let me say a word about the Building Resilient Regions project. It began around 2003 and went through a planning phase, and in roughly 2006 I joined to help lead the work on immigration, and we carried through about 2012. And the website, which is berkeley.edu, has a wealth of studies that we put together, and if you're interested in finding out a little bit more about resilience in other contexts besides immigration, I would recommend that you check out the website and some of the articles posted there. We had a lot of foresight back in 2003 using the term resilience for our project. It wasn't really very much in currency before that time, but after Hurricane Katrina in 2005 and later Superstorm Sandy in New York in 2012, almost everyone began to use the word and use it as a goal for municipalities that were under environmental threats, and it's become almost a ubiquitous term. However, it's normally used almost entirely in the context of environmental challenges, such as destructive storms, storm surges, flooding, and the like, with the idea that affected areas need to show resilience not only by rebuilding what was there before, but by rebuilding in a smarter way that will make them less vulnerable next time around. Our understanding of resilience, of course, was informed by climate challenges, but really went far beyond that. We defined resilience as a city region's capacity to absorb a major external shock and to regain its footing afterwards, not necessarily on exactly the same path, but a path that would be optimal for, given the possibilities for the place at that moment. Achieving a new trajectory that was the best that circumstances would allow. We drew on many different streams of research, from work on psychology on individuals and families to work from sociology on groups and communities, for example, the literature on communities that suffered disasters, to work from political science on cities, states, or provinces, and nations. Migration certainly calls for individual resilience on the part of the migrants. But here in this project, we're focusing more on the reaction of the receiving context. Our unit of analysis was much bigger than the individual or family or even immigrant community, but the larger community that surrounded it. While the psychological work was intriguing, the analogy of individual processes with collective processes is inexact. But the literature on trust, coalition formation, bargaining, social capital, and the like was very helpful. We wanted to be able to argue that jurisdictions, the boundaries of which we deliberately left somewhat vague for the moment, with more organized and linked nodes of collective action, would be more able to take strategic actions to position themselves both before a shock occurs and after it happens, and that this would be reflected in better outcomes subsequent to the shock. In that sense, it was a counter argument to the famous argument by the economist Charles Thibault that fragmented metropolises, highly competitive metropolises, were in a sense more efficient market mechanisms than deliberate governance might be. We also wanted to go far beyond environmental challenges. We were concerned with at least 3 other major challenges. Economic restructuring, which could take the form both of rapid growth, such as has happened in some of the newer metropolises in the U.S., and also serious economic decline, which was characteristic of the Rust Belt in the north central part of the country. We were also interested in the changing spatial patterns of metropolitan inequality, and we've had a phenomenon in the U.S., I'm not sure how much this applies to Canada, with the suburbanization of poverty and, in a sense, the resurgence of of some central cities, pushing poverty out more towards the periphery. And finally, and this is where I came in, we were interested in the dramatic demographic changes taking place in the US and in Canada as well that are driven in large part by immigration. Finally, we differed from other strands of thinking about how places respond by wanting to emphasize their metropolitan shape or dimension or scope. We saw central cities and their suburbs as being ultimately all in it together, strongly interlinked, so that you couldn't simply look at central cities as a separate unit of analysis. You had to look at whole metropolitan areas. And as we know, these metropolitan areas are politically quite fragmented, both in the US and in Canada. And so the question was, could these fragmented parts pull together to develop coherent, sorry, it's too low. Coherent responses to these different challenges. Now, for the record, we did lots of interesting work about how to define and measure the components of metropolitan cooperation and how they related to measurable outcomes. And some of this work is available on the website, and we might discuss it further in a Q&A if you like. My part with Manuel Pastor was to organize a group investigating how regions have responded in political and policy terms to the rapid growth of new immigrant communities since roughly 1980. And let's see, do I want to change the slide here? Well, I'll get to that in a second. We decided that we needed to look across a range of different kinds of metro areas and that we would distinguish between traditional receiving metro areas like New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles that had relatively long histories of fairly large flows of immigrants, with new destinations like Charlotte, North Carolina, Phoenix, Arizona, the Inland Empire east of LA, the Riverside, San Bernardino Inland Empire, and San Jose, California. And we wanted to look at what was going not only in the central city of each, major central city of each region, but also at least some of the more far-flung suburbs, so as to measure the presence or absence of some degree of regional collaboration, or at least learning in responses to immigration. I suppose Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver would probably all fall into the former category of traditional receiving areas in Canada, while Calgary might fall into the latter. We recruited top researchers already familiar with each region, and joining me in New York City were Else de Graaf, who's a professor at the City University of New York, and Diana Gordon from CUNY as well. Manuel and his colleagues at USC did the California cases. Jaime Dominguez from Northwestern worked on Chicago, Michael Jones Correa on Charlotte, and Marie Provine and Paul Lewis, who are based at Arizona State University in Phoenix, worked on Phoenix. In the end, as we were writing up our work, we rejected the idea of resilience for the title of the book that we're editing out of this work. And that's in part because we didn't want people to make a direct analogy between a natural disaster like Superstorm Sandy and the arrival of a new contingent of immigrants. For one thing, immigrants bring as many positives as they bring negatives. So we didn't want to categorize them just as a sort of negative shock on the local system, which could be said of some of the other challenges that cities faced if they faced drastic economic downturn or an environmental threat. But we do understand that whatever their long-term positive impact, the rise of new immigrant communities can include some short-term negatives. In particular, as relatively low-income groups, they require services, not only education for their children, but many other kinds of social services, which localities must finance, often with little help from national governments. Equally important, native-born populations become uneasy when they see threats to their cultural dominance, as is implied by the fact that non-Hispanic whites will fall below half of the U.S. population somewhere in the middle of the 21st century. Okay. So slide 3, which you're seeing, lays out the key questions we wanted to address in this study. Number 1, what factors shape how regions respond positively or negatively to recent rapid immigration? And second, in what sense do these responses reflect the presence or absence of some sort of resilience in terms of the collective decision-making processes that go on in central cities and metro areas? And just to give you an idea of the range of possibilities, we consider New York City to be a very pro-immigrant place. I understand Toronto has 50% of the population is foreign-born here. It's about 37% in New York City. So we're both outliers in terms of being heavily immigrant cities at this point. And both cities, I think, and certainly New York, considers itself to be quite pro-immigrant. We have Mayor's Office of Immigrant Integration. We have a number of immigrant origin city council members on our 51-member city council, at least 15% or so, along with other visible minorities who have native-born origins. And everywhere you look in policy, there's a deliberate effort to take steps that will help integrate immigrants. We have a municipal ID card so that people without documentation can get a form of ID that's useful for a variety of purposes, and many other programs. You go to the other end of Phoenix, Arizona, which is famous for having a sheriff, Sheriff Arpaio, and a state legislature that adopted SB 1070, which required local law enforcement officers to demand proof of legitimacy of residence anytime they stopped somebody in the course of law enforcement activities. And they're on the border. They face a lot of irregular migration through the state of Arizona, and this generated a very hostile and negative reaction to immigrants in the city. So you have a very broad range of variants across metro areas as to the kind of response. So in the next several minutes, I'm going to give you an overview of how we went about our research, the cases we chose, some charts showing their makeup, and then I'll conclude with some lessons that come out of our comparative work and speculate on what they might mean for us and for Canada. So as I said already, we wanted to contrast different kinds of receiving environments or contexts, traditional versus new, and we wanted to compare these regions. Most studies of immigrant integration look at things like educational attainment in the first or second generation, what kind of jobs immigrants are in, what incomes those jobs generate, how is that gap narrowing over time, and so forth. There's sort of standard socioeconomic analysis that might come out of economics or sociology. And of course, those are very important things to know about as a kind of background for this study, but we really wanted to focus on political responses, the collective and institutional response to new communities, and to what extent was it warm and welcoming versus cold and rejecting, and what specific forms did it take in bureaucratic practices and local legislation and so on. The other thing that is really quite different about our study is that we wanted to look at the suburban fringe as well as the central cities. Typically, immigrants in the first wave settle in the central cities. The central cities have had much more experience historically in dealing with immigrants, and the suburbs were places where middle-class white people moved out to after World War II and generally had much less experience with immigrants. But that is changing rapidly in the U.S., and I understand here in Toronto as well. So this just gives you a map of where these places are. I'm sure you're all familiar with them, more or less. So this gives you a little idea of migration trends since 1980, broken down by the central cities versus the suburbs in the metro. We didn't get the Inland Empire on this chart because it didn't quite fit, so I'm sorry about that, but the book will have all of them in it. So we think of LA as a very immigrant city, and it certainly is. But if you look at those bars on the far left-hand side of the chart, you can see that after very rapid increases from 80 to 90, the increases tailed off, and actually immigration has subsided in LA. And the growth of the Latino population in LA County now is from the children of immigrants and not from immigrants. And there's a net outflow of immigrants from the city of Los Angeles. And then the next set of bars over shows you that there was a sort of lagging jump and increase in the immigrant population of the suburban areas of the Los Angeles metro area. And that now the suburbs are almost as immigrant as the central city. And you can see similar patterns in the other old receiving cities. And then you jump over to San Jose, and you can see the very rapid increase in the principal cities, San Jose being the principal city, more recently, to make them even more immigrant at this point than Los Angeles or New York. And you can see other quite rapid increases in the other new receiving areas. So migration has clearly diffused away from the old centers that used to attract the main part of immigration in the U.S., and it's also, within metropolitan areas, diffused away from central cities towards their suburbs. Now, it might be a little hard to read this chart, but it was inspired by some work that Bill Fry, a demographer at Michigan and the Brookings Institution, has done to distinguish the demographic makeup of people older than 65 or 65 and older versus 18 or younger. Sort of, you know, the bulk of the last wave and the adults who probably exercise disproportionate power versus the youth who were emerging. And if you think about the demographic distance between these groups, we see that as setting up for the potential for conflict between groups and between generations. And you'll notice that Phoenix has one of the largest, or maybe the largest in the country, difference between only 46% of people under 18 being non-Hispanic whites and 86% of the older generation being non-Hispanic whites. This kind of generational change is what's often disturbing to the old establishment, or the people who consider themselves the heart and soul of culturally of what a place means. And you can see that there are differences in all these places, but if you subtract the under 18 percentage from the over 65 percentage of non-Hispanic whites, you can see that it ranges from 30, 25, 28 or so. In the older metropolitan areas, there's a gap, but it's relatively small. But in the newer metropolitan areas, the gaps are bigger, with Phoenix being a kind of very pronounced case. Okay, I could do a little run through of what each of the cases is like, if you would like. But I'm conscious of the time, and I want to leave plenty of time for question and answers. So maybe I'll just leave, if you have questions about any of what's going on in any of these specific places, I could try to respond to them in the questions and answer period. But let me try to extract what I think our key findings are. And you can read them as easily as I can say them here. Demographic context is important, especially when the immigrant streams are relatively poor, low-skilled, low levels of education, high rates of being undocumented, and therefore capable of being negatively racialized by the receiving group. And if there's big class and racial differences between who's coming in and who the receiving majority are, that sets up a potential for trouble. And to the extent that the immigrant groups are varied and in terms of class as well as national origin and racial composition, that can soften those differences. So you just imagine in Phoenix, the immigrant flow is largely Mexican and very large shares of undocumented people and very low levels of education and so forth. Whereas in San Jose, you have Indian engineers working for Google, and in Silicon Valley, generally there are quite a few, both South Asians and East Asians, highly educated that are working in IT sectors, and so you can't just say, well, an immigrant equals an undocumented worker from Mexico, which is what Americans often leap to that conclusion, even if it's not warranted by the actual demographic evidence. So that, that mix kind of sets up the background, sets up the framework. But that's all interpreted through a set of political processes. It's just a sense of potentials, and it can be realized in lots of different forms across these cities. And one danger is that there'll be fertile grounds for an anti-immigrant populist response. And that's exactly what we see to some degree in most of the new receiving contexts that we looked at, particularly in Phoenix, but also in the Inland Empire east of Los Angeles. And that potential is greatest where there are the fewest sort of legacy of past immigrations that have created immigrant-serving organizations, or that have meant that labor unions have largely immigrant memberships, and therefore unions have gravitated to from being somewhat anti-immigrant because of concern over competition for jobs to being very pro-immigrant because their members are immigrants. Or political parties that have sought immigrant votes to help themselves stay in power. One interesting thing about the Chicago case is, as you probably know, Chicago has had a lot of black-white political conflict and competition over the last decades, and the white ethnic base of the Democratic machine has been gradually dwindling away, and both the Daley machine and its successor in Rahm Emanuel have decided that latching on to the growing Latino vote is going to be a way to counter the potential of a black challenge. And so in Chicago's ethnic politics, we've morphed from the Irish and the Polish being this key to the base of the Democratic Party to Latinos, who are also sort of predominantly Catholic, being an important base of the machine. So where you have a legacy of various different kinds of political organizations that have a stake in promoting immigrant rights and immigrant integration, you have a sort of social fabric or a social base that at the very least it provides a kind of insulation against right-wing anti-immigrant populism that would have much more freedom for operation if those counter institutions didn't exist. We also found that it matters a lot. I mean, in the old days, we might have said, what does the power structure think? It matters a lot what the local business elites think about this and do about this. And I would again range from, and think of new immigrant destinations. Silicon Valley, San Jose is a big city in the southern part of Santa Clara County, in the south end of the Bay Area, in San Francisco Bay Area. It's home to Google and Facebook and, you name it. And a lot of very, prosperous high information technology businesses that are very well organized. They compete among themselves, but they also have established a very strong kind of business planning presence. So they've gotten together, for example, around building affordable housing in Silicon Valley so that they can have a workforce. They've gotten together around, there's actually a fair amount of labor management collaboration over training programs. So the IT industry in Silicon Valley has been the biggest a big booster for national immigration reform and increasing the number of H-1B visas, and the business elite is very strongly pro-immigrant. And indeed, a lot of the successful entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley come from an immigrant background. So you have a cohesive business community there that is 100% pro-immigrant. And if anybody sort of stuck up their head and said, we don't want any, Mexicans go home back across the border, they would immediately, kind of clamp down on that. And then you shift to Phoenix, which doesn't really have a very much of an organized business elite. And they weren't cohesive at all. And it was only after the Arizona State Legislature adopted a whole series of very draconian anti-immigrant measures that the Phoenix and Arizona business community finally got together and said to the Republican Party in the state of Arizona that they should cool it, that they'd kind of overdone it, and they were going to give the region a black eye. And Charlotte, North Carolina is kind of somewhere in the middle, in the sense that it became a very strong banking center, and sort of like Atlanta, the elites of Charlotte wanted to project the city as like Atlanta, a city too busy to hate, that it was the New South, that it was very welcoming and not harboring various kinds of prejudices. And even though the former mayor of Charlotte, who went on to become the governor of North Carolina, a Republican governor, and helped to spearhead some anti-immigrant measures in North Carolina, in the city, and Charlotte as a combined city-county region, the business community was always kind of moderating the potential for anti-immigrant responses. Have I said everything I want to say here? I guess I should say a little more about what leads to strongly pro-immigrant. I've done something to explain that what might lead to anti-immigrant responses, but what leads to pro-immigrant responses. And I've hinted at that in terms of the rise of immigrant-serving organizations, the role of unions. I haven't mentioned the role of religion, but the Catholic Archdiocese in a number of places have played important pro-immigrant roles, and the Democratic Party, to the extent that it begins to realize that it needs immigrant votes to compete, also can be a very strong force. But I would perhaps also highlight the role of some key immigrant serving and immigrant advocacy organizations. In Chicago, for example, there's an organization called the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights that operates on a statewide basis, even though it's largely based in Chicago. And given Chicago's very strong influence on the metro area through Cook County and also the Illinois legislature, early on ICIRR got the state to adopt a whole set of very pro-immigrant requirements for all state agencies, which it then moved to help implement at the local level, mostly in greater Chicagoland. So a highly effective political actor in that context. And New York City has some similar types of organizations. The New York Immigration Coalition is a kind of trade association for immigrant-serving nonprofits, but it's also a strong research and advocacy organization. The labor unions, especially, we were talking about the role of Unite, HERE, here in Toronto. That's an important union in the New York metro area, along with some other SEIU locals like the healthcare workers 1199. A lot of immigrants work in the healthcare sector, so 1199 is extremely progressive union on that front, and they operate not just in the city, but throughout the region. Make the Road New York is well, it used to be called Make the Road New York. Now it's Make the Road, period, because they're working in a lot of other places. So I've mentioned some of the types of entities and organizations and collaborations that produce some positive responses across metro areas. Yes. So concluding thoughts. I wouldn't say that we've exactly proven that you could measure a resilient configuration of interests in some prior time and prove that they led to better outcomes in a later time. We've never really econometrically or in a modeling sense been able to sufficiently define all our terms and measure them over time and create a regression equation that makes us convinced that A leads to B. But the cases are very consistent, I would say, or consonant with this type of conclusion that the balance of forces and the degree of cooperation among the forces and their willingness to commit to a pro-immigrant stance is very important determinant of how these more abstract background characteristics of race and class and demographic positioning are converted into actual policy. And, you know, we would draw causal support from the fact that Charlotte is doing better than Phoenix or the Inland Empire, and that New York, which is arguably, you know, the most pro-immigrant city, is doing better than Los Angeles. But these, you know, each case is very complex, and it's hard to, you know, extract across them and to, you know, come up with something. You know, there are more variables than there are cases in this type of study, so we can't say we've definitively proven it from a quantitative point of view. The picture is complex in the suburbs, and there's a great deal of variation in how they've responded. There are some immigrant-dominant suburbs in our case studies, like the city of Maywood in Los Angeles, or Mountain View, which is an important city within Santa Clara County, but much smaller than San Jose, that are sort of like mini central cities and have drawn pro-immigrant support from the same kind of bases as the big central cities. But then there are other areas that have been much more unwelcoming of immigrants, both in the old receiving areas and in the new receiving areas. And in general, we do not see very much regional cooperation or collaboration. And in fact, Irene Blomrad and Elster Graw, who worked on our New York case study, have written a nice paper about municipal free riding on, talking about the suburbs, free riding on the immigrant-serving capacities of the central city. So the suburban municipalities say, well, immigration, that's San Francisco's problem or New York's problem. That's, go to New York and look for an organization there that can help you. So the responses have been much slower to develop, and there's no real place other than perhaps Chicago through the ICIRR and the state level measures that they got adopted, where you could say there's sort of a comprehensive regional response to immigration. So to conclude, the question of immigration reform is at its most conflictual and partisanly polarized condition right now than it's ever been in the U.S. The leading Republicans are 100% against immigration reform, and the Democrats are 100% in favor of it. And given that the Republicans are likely to continue to have a majority in one or both houses of Congress, the chance politically to really break that logjam and develop a bipartisan set of reforms that will strengthen our national responses to immigration seems unlikely. But there, under that polarized surface, there are a lot of parties on all sides who have been, because there's a lot of business support for immigration reform. There's a lot of support for immigration reform within the base of the Republican Party. It just hasn't been able to find support from the leaders at all. But were we to get immigration reform, and were we to get more clearer federal support, national government support for promoting immigrant integration efforts at the local level, some of the things that we need to do are pretty clear. Number one, both the federal agencies and the local response capacity is not well organized to address where the problem is emerging, or where the immigrant populations are emerging most quickly now, which is in the suburban areas of the major metro areas. So federal policymakers really need to think, and to some degree state and municipal policymakers also need to think about, how do we regionalize the response capacity that's now pretty much concentrated in the central cities. And at a local level, this could be done by unions or Roman Catholic Archdiocese, or organizations that do operate more on a regional basis, or if there are business coalitions that are operating on a regional basis. That all of these could be vectors for developing more effective regional responses. So let me leave you there. Both Manuel and I are doing interesting things that you can find on our websites that are separate from the website of the BRR project, but I would encourage you to look at all three. And I would very much like to thank you for the opportunity to be with you, and to take any questions that you might have before we, if there are points of clarification before we shift into the panel. Thanks. Sure.
I'm with the local immigration partnership in New York region, so that's in Toronto. I'm just wondering about the data source where you captured the immigrants in the main cities and then also the smaller city centers. Was it upon arrival, or was that data from when they were already living in the cities?
It's from when they were already living. So we rely on two basic data sources. One is called the American Community Survey, which is something that the Census Bureau does every year, about a 1% sample of the country, and then they combine it together, either 3 years or 5 years worth of data, that makes it available both at the census tract level and then at a larger geography. The microdata are also available. So that allows you to, parse these geographic differences. And we also use the Current Population Survey, which is the monthly labor force survey. And the CPS is interesting. It's much smaller samples, so you can't really, there are a lot of central cities that you can't identify very well. But the CPS asks both where you were born and where your parents were born, so you can identify the children of immigrants who happen to be born here. So these data, the ones that I showed you in the chart, are only about foreign-born people. If you included in their children, that would almost double the immigrant origin population in a lot of these places.
I have a microphone for whoever wants to ask the following.
Okay, to record. I wish, it sounds like I needed to say some more disturbing things to really get you going. Yes, and back, and then you add.
Hi, thank
Hi.
you for the talk. I'm wondering if there's anything, if you can add a little bit more to the piece on the importance of the immigrant serving organizations and that whole layer.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm asking for a couple of reasons. One is because, some of those organizations come out of a long history, sometimes of struggle, of ethnic organizing, of all sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
So in a way that suggests that there might be hope in those areas where they are thinner on the ground. So I'm just wondering a bit of how a bit of a historical
Right.
perspective might add. And then just in terms of their presence, I'm wondering how you measured or captured that in terms of sort of numbers, of alliances, of inter-ethnic, racialized connections. How do we make sense of that, if you can expand?
So I think that there was a broad shift after the War on Poverty of the Great Society period of the mid-'60s in the U.S., that federal policy and even city policy gravitated from the direct provision of services to relying on community-based nonprofit organizations to deliver services. And there's been a pretty substantial shift in that direction. And you could say in a way that that was a kind of co-optation or political taming of the community revolution of the late 60s and into the 70s, the ferment of urban organizing against urban renewal and demand for participation and that sort of thing. And that had a couple of effects. On the one hand, the groups that came to rely on government funding, government contracts, were less likely to be engaged in community organizing and active protest, and more likely to shift towards direct service provision. And the leader-constituent relationship morphed into a professional-client relationship often in these organizations. But they retained strong elements of their sort of up-from-below origins as they professionalized and as they became reliant on government money. And originally in the U.S., these were not immigrant origin populations. The minority groups in central cities were African American or Puerto Rican, or there were third generation plus Latinos in other parts of the Southwest. But the immigrant organizing activities were sort of the next wave. I mean, immigrant communities began to grow after the 1965 immigration reform in the U.S., and they were building momentum through the 70s, and then really sort of beginning in the 1980s, there were more organizations to develop to both serve immigrants, maybe in the Catholic Charities sense or the social work sense, but also to be advocacy organizations on behalf of immigrants, and to bang on city government to get it to recognize that new communities were emerging and that they needed new and different things. So that in that sort of 35-year period between 1980 and the present, areas with substantial immigrant communities did develop fairly rich and complex ecologies of immigrant-serving organizations. We didn't take a formal survey of them in our comparative case studies, but the principal investigators for all those case studies, each one of them probably developed something close to a complete census of immigrant-serving organizations. And our strategy was to interview a number of the leadership so that we got a good sense of what was going on. And many of those cities, like the New York Immigration Coalition, is a kind of alliance of all these immigrant-serving organizations in New York City. They don't include all of them, but they include a big, cross-section, so that that sector has really, in some places, matured quite a bit and has become a pretty strong organizing force. So I don't know what the law says exactly in Canada, but I assume it's pretty similar to the U.S. law that nonprofits are not allowed to engage in overtly political activities like supporting candidates and making campaign contributions. But there are a lot of things that those organizations can do one step short of that. They can engage in voter registration campaigns. They can have politicians come talk to their membership. They can let their membership know that this person is your friend and that person is your enemy. And to the extent that they become a cohesive voting force, politicians will notice that. They can hold forums about issues where candidates come and give their opinions. So they can engage politically short of making campaign contributions or overt endorsements. But the other thing, Elster Graw has just finished this great book. It'll be published by Cornell Press next year about immigrant-serving organizations in San Francisco and how they managed to get some of the most pro-immigrant measures in the whole country adopted, like minimum wage and sick leave and things of this sort. And one thing that she points out is that even if nonprofit organizations are barred from overt political activity, they can advocate legislation and they can work with bureaucrats who are developing and implementing the legislation. And oftentimes the bureaucrats see these organizations as having the expertise to know what the constituents need, what the clients need, and how to deliver it most effectively. And so the organizations become the allies of the people in the city administration in important ways. So over a long period of time, I think that the infrastructure of nonprofit organizations, even though it's kind of formally politically constrained, has become a very important political force in lots of different cities that have histories of migration. Now, is that responsive enough to your question, or have I missed something?
Yeah, no, that's certainly part of it, but in terms of time, I'm just wondering, because that's an important contextual piece in the story here.
Right.
But in some of the areas that are less inclusive and less resilient, they're not as thick, they're not as present, because there hasn't been as much immigration.
Absolutely.
But in the future, I guess I'm wondering about, over time, assuming that that
I
does
would like
build
to
up.
see, there are some foundations in New York that work in the suburbs that do this kind of organizational development work just only out in the suburbs. But it would also be nice to see funders, like foundations in particular, who can have more degrees of freedom, encourage the city-based organizations to start to work in the suburbs. I mean, that would be the obvious thing, is to sort of export their activities and talents. But it would be interesting to know, unfortunately, this was not as well funded a project as we would have liked, and we were relying sort of on what people already knew or had collected. And in each case, we picked out one suburb to really, one or two suburbs to look at. And, it would be a big research project to look at the whole range of suburbs and to find out who's active or not, and, where the impetus might come to spread that activity around. So as far as the sort of next research challenge that comes out of this work, I would say that would be one of the most important ones. Yes, and, I was going to ask you.
It's okay.
Okay, it's you? Okay, I'm back.
I have a very simple question though. Sorry. We all know that immigrants have problems in different countries. I don't want that, I just have to say. We all know that immigrants have problems in different countries. So I'm just asking about, because you have done a lot of research and developed case studies. So I just have a very simple question, that what is the best pragmatic way to integrate those immigrants? Because immigrants are highly skilled at times also as taking into consideration the example of Mexican people, they are non-skilled, but a lot of Indians are skilled and they are there and they have also a lot of problems. So what is the best pragmatic way to integrate them? Because they go to US or maybe Canada with a lot of expectations, having sets of skills to integrate themselves into that particular developed society. So what is the best pragmatic way to integrate them into the society with, and where do they get facilitation in a straight way? I know that a lot of non-profit organizations are there, city government helps are there, but still people are hopeless. So it's not a negative point, but I'm just asking the best practical manner. Thank you.
Well, I don't want to seem like I'm not answering the question by saying it depends a lot on the specific context, but it does. So first thing to do is to diagnose what's the political opportunity structure of the place that you're in. Obviously, getting the group organized is number one. So an internal process of who are they, where are they, sign them up. Let's have some discussions about what the issues are. Let's develop a platform of things that we want to see happen, and let's start advocating them and just engage the democratic process wherever you are. But then I would also think, how does your group have bridges to institutions that have influence, and how can we use those connections to magnify our voice? And that might be, workers in the healthcare industry could, if they were members of the hospital workers union or the healthcare union, could work within the union to, get the union leadership to not just say, okay, we're going to have a Jamaica Day or something like that, but actually to press some grievance, some need for that particular community. So, if I was to come up with a general answer to your question, it would be organize the group and then apply that organizational capacity in whatever way seems to be likely to yield the best effect in that circumstance. Yes, and back. Sorry to make you run around there.
Yes, I see a problem with Canada. If you need a receipt for income taxes, this government is using that power to revoke anyone who's going against, who's trying to who do any advocacy at all. So you do some advocacy to change system, you may lose your tax right to use that tax money, income tax money you receive. Number two, the organizations that are around, like the services to help immigrants or the poor, they do a lot of writing papers, but none of them actually do any work to try to prevent people from being poor or getting jobs in the first place. They do help people that get that. Their goal is to help writing papers to put on the shelves, and I don't see how that's going to do any good. Okay, bye.
I'm sympathetic. Advocacy professionals deal in a world of ideas and position papers and testimony and that sort of thing, and maybe we're more comfortable with that than getting out in the streets and actually organizing protests or actions of different sorts. But I find this organization, Make the Road, quite interesting because it was started by a bunch of immigrant origin law students from New York University. So they weren't coming from, impoverished or uneducated backgrounds, but they were quite ideologically committed to the idea of organizing immigrant communities in New York City. And so they started a campaign in a number of poor neighborhoods to identify immigrant workers who were not getting paid what they were supposed to be paid because they were undocumented and they could be easily exploited by their employers. And so they went around and identified all these people, and then they conducted a campaign of demonstrations in front of the different stores that were where the employers were engaging in this practice, and through publicity and tenacity and the regulatory power of the state labor department, they actually got back wages paid to a substantial number of people. So yes, you know, a lot of this work is generating paper and trying to change ideas, but organizing on the ground and being willing to, you know, sometimes confront the system in ways that the system isn't always comfortable with, I think is necessary as well. And
I work for as an advocate at a food bank. Their problem is to get all this food from a big shot grocery store, Loblaws, and corporate. If they go against, say, all these, take a lot of money for giving food that no one wants to us. If they protest, they're going to lose that money. They cannot protest with that.
yeah, it's a fine line. I mean, going back to the earlier question about the advocacy of the 60s morphing into the community-based service organizations of the 2000s and the reliance on government contracts, and the fact that if you do something to upset your political patrons, they might take the money away from you is real. So the only way to defend against that is to have a sort of lateral base among all these organizations such that they can stand up to pressure from the, you know, the potential sanctions of the politicians. And you might look at Make the Road on their website and read about them in the press, because somehow they've managed to pull off that trick better than a lot of other organizations. Question over one or two? We'll do two. There, and the lady in back with her hand up. Sure, that's a good idea.
Yeah. So thank you. Very interesting. My question was around the business elites that you mentioned as, you know, sort of in some cases organizing to support immigration into their area. We've seen in our research kind of variation, I guess, in that. And one of the things was around demand conditions. So in some cases there is, you know, business is interested in attracting either skilled immigrants with a particular area of expertise, or just their, you know, in Calgary, for example, just recently there was, you know, huge economic growth and they were dying to have people. In other cases, not so much. And then, you know, a lot of barriers being erected by business to recognizing credentials and things like that. So I just wondered if you'd seen similar variation in your sample.
The other question, and unfortunately this is the last question.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the talk. I found it very interesting. I work with the Toronto Newcomer Office. We're housed at the City of Toronto, and we work with all three levels of government as well as the community sector to help develop strategies for successful settlement and integration of newcomers to the City of Toronto. So my question is, I know you mentioned the importance of the municipality in several cases as far as creating a positive environment and positive sort of perception of newcomers coming into the area. And you mentioned a couple of strategies from New York, the mayor's office and the municipal ID card. My question is around, were there any other sort of promising strategies or best practices that you saw municipalities engaging in that could potentially be replicated, say, in Toronto, that would be very good for sort of ensuring the settlement and integration of newcomers to a community?
So I'll try to give quick answers because I know you need to keep the show on the road. Yes, there's a lot of variation in business response. But I would just say that there's also a lot of potential support within the business community generally, and sometimes it's organized and sometimes it's just latent. So it's worthwhile to try to make the latent manifest. And you know, Michael Bloomberg was a good mayor in certain ways, even though he was you know, a multi-billionaire mayor, and he's organized a national business coalition in favor of immigration reform in the United States, and the Bloomberg Philanthropists put a lot of money into trying to spread the influence of that. And perhaps you could see something like that emerging in Canada. And for the last question, we're going to have the 8th National Immigrant Integration Conference in New York and Brooklyn on December 13th and 14th. And this is a national gathering of organizations like the Illinois Coalition and New York Immigration Coalition, and these sort of advocacy organizations form the organizing committee for this conference, and there will be people from the organizations, from city agencies, advocates, from all over the country coming to that. And I would say, if you can, come to that. If you can't, then at least look at the webcasts of the different events, because it'll be a very fertile set of discussions about exactly this. What are the best practices, and who's getting the most juice out of what, where? So keep your eye on that. Over to you.